Thank you, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of Let's Talk Policy at the Kautilya School of Public Policy, part of Geetham University. We are extremely happy to have with us this evening India's former National Security Advisor and one of the most distinguished foreign policy thinkers, Mr. Shivshankar Menon, who's just out with his new book, India and Asian Geopolitics, The Past, Present. And Mr. Menon, so wonderful to have you with us. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time to listen to Mr. Menon speak, just a brief background on him. He has served in distinguished positions such as National Security Advisor during Dr. Manmohan Singh's tenure as Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary of India. He was also envoy to key neighboring countries such as China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, as well as Israel. So he has had a vast experience as far as diplomacy and foreign policy is concerned. And this new book in particular is interesting because it looks at India's foreign policy trajectory right from independence and looks at it from a different point of view, purely through India's geographical position. So, Mr. Menon, thank you very much for joining us. And there's so much to talk about as the world grapples with the pandemic and vaccine diplomacy is taking place. But I wanted to talk about specifically the book first. And first, tell us, why you chose to look at foreign policy through the prism of geography. You've explained it in the book, but why does that become so important, geography, rather than history?
Well, thank you, Nidhi. Thank you for that flattering introduction, and thank you for having me and for asking me here. The reason I chose this lens to look at it is because I think we spend a lot of time thinking of India's relations with the US, with Russia, with big countries, and so on. But how the world looks, how you react to it, depends on where you sit, depends on where you are. I mean, we know that as a fact from our lives, but India is a nation power. And I think we underestimate how much influence Asia has had on us and how much influence we have in Asia, and how that dynamic has actually shaped not just our foreign policy, but a lot of things about us. So that's really why I looked at it from that point of view. I think it's a useful lens. It's a useful descriptive lens. I don't think it's a very good prescriptive lens. I mean, it doesn't tell you what to do for the future. That's up to you to figure out your own interests and to see what you do. But I do think it's a lens which I think we used to use very often, but now we think of ourselves as global and somehow, not being where we are. And frankly, the harder the world gets, which is what's really happening around us, not just COVID, but this whole shift in the balance of power, the world economy is slowing. The harder the world gets, the more important our immediate neighborhood is for us. And I'm convinced that our future is really in our neighborhood. And by neighborhood, I mean not just the subcontinent or the Indian Ocean region, but Asia as a whole.
Let's talk about that in some more detail, because you have gone into quite a bit of detail, obviously, with regard to China's rise, as well as India-China relations. And you've said that the older understandings with China can no longer work. The events of the last couple of years obviously are testament to that, and that the next few years may be more difficult than the last 3 decades for the India-China relationship. Can I first ask you, Mr. Menon, why do you think that China has become so overtly aggressive when it comes to its relations with India over the last few years? And I don't mean just aggressive at the border, but whether it is opposing India's entry into the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or any other multilateral forum, the way it behaves at the UN, for example, with regard to terrorist designations. Why is it so overt now, this aggression?
Well, it's not only with India. I mean, it's across the board. It's in China's relationship with Japan, the East China Sea, Senkaku, Diaoyu, Taiwan, South China Sea. So, and her relationship with the US is much harder. So she is much more assertive since roughly about 2008, but certainly since 2012, when President Xi Jinping came to power. It seems to me there's both internal and sort of external explanations for this behavior. One, of course, is clear that after the global financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese thought their moment had come, that the West was in terminal decline, that the US was in economic collapse, and that, which of course didn't happen. I mean, the US actually did better as an economy in recovering from the crash of 2008 than Europe did or most other countries did. And now I think, and also I think for the Chinese, they have told themselves a story about how China was always number one in the world through history and then went through a century of humiliation at the hands of the West. But now China is restoring herself to her rightful place. The problem is that the environment has got much harder for that. China is in a crowded neighborhood. She's not the only country who's rising. India is rising. Japan has already risen. She has other big established powers on her borders, Russia as well, Vietnam, Korea, Indonesia. Lots of countries are rising in Asia. And the US is pushing back because the US is the global superpower, the only global superpower right now in military terms. China might be an economic superpower, but she is not yet capable of projecting military power across the world. So, and China is aging very rapidly. If you look at the figures, according to present trends, by 2040, she'll be as gray as Japan is today. And so her economy is slowing as a result. And the world economy is much slower, much more difficult. So it seems to me China's in a hurry. It's not only that she thought her moment had come and therefore decided to reveal her ambitions, but also that she's in a hurry. She needs to do it now. This is her moment of relative advantage. And this is why we see a very pushy China. That's my explanation in the book. There might be other explanations, but for me, it seems to me that they know that this window of opportunity is closing. They can't go on. They're not growing at 10% anymore. They say 6%. It's probably somewhere between 2 and 3 to 4%. And with an aging society, with a crowded neighborhood, with an economy reverting to mean, I think, frankly, this makes China even keener to try and push out and achieve her goals and achieve primacy, not just in Asia, but ultimately in the global system.
So when you say that the next few years will be far more difficult for the India-China relationship than the last 3 decades, what should we expect in your view?
Well, I think already India-China relations are in crisis since last year. You saw what happened on the border. The Chinese tried to change the status quo and have changed it in certain respects. And they, in other words, basically, the various agreements, the standard operating procedures, which had kept the peace and for about 30 years, kept the border where it was, the line of actual control, all that they've tried to change. And now the whole line is live. But they have other problems as well. China is the only great power which does not take kindly to India's rise. And you can see it in, say, I mean, the Security Council seat is maybe a litmus test. Everybody else supports India having a permanent seat on the Security Council. The Chinese are the only ones who actually oppose it as a great power. And you've seen signs of friction in various ways. An increased Chinese commitment to Pakistan, a very strong Chinese presence in the military presence in the Indian Ocean since 2014, which is new. Chinese activism in the subcontinent. If you look at Chinese BRI commitments just to our neighbors, it's over $100 billion. That's a lot of money. It's actually the biggest single. You look at CPEC, you look at China and Gwadar. So there's a whole host of things that China is doing which have affected the bilateral relationship. But I think the real reason, and if you look at it over the last few years, Chinese will have their complaints. Here, India refused to sign on to BRI, to the Belt and Road Initiative, wouldn't even attend the forum. Everybody else did. Even the US attended, but we didn't. Chinese will say that we've got very close militarily to the US. They forget that they were much closer to the US than we have ever been or are today. And that they were in a virtual alliance against the Soviet Union for almost 2 decades until the Soviet Union collapsed. So I think the problem here, frankly, is that until about 2 years ago, the Chinese used to expect other countries to be neutral in their quarrels with other people. let's say, China-US relations got much more contentious. So they wanted other people neutral. From about 2 years ago, they started saying India is no longer non-aligned, meaning that we've gone over to the dark side. As our relationship with the US improved, we see India-China relations as sui generis, driven by its own. For us, the boundary, what they do, these things matter. China's attitude to us, the trade deficit, which they refuse to solve, etc. But I think they look at it in a larger sense. And once they saw or decided that we had already were no longer neutral or non-aligned on their issues, I think they thought now is the time to teach India that they have to deal with us directly.
Interesting. And since you spoke about sort of the alliance with the US, let me just take some of the questions we're getting in from our participants today. Tahir Bhatt wants to ask you that how can the Quad alliance, how will that further sow seeds of enmity between India and China? Will that keep both regional powers at daggers drawn, essentially? I have a follow-up to that, but I'll let you answer this first. Will the Quad only worsen ties between the two countries?
The Chinese first reaction was, oh, it's just foam on the sea. It's nothing. It means nothing. But if it means nothing, then why are you reacting so strongly? Now they've gone to, oh, it's a nation, NATO, it's importing the Cold War thinking, and so on. For me, frankly, I don't see what the Chinese are objecting to. What does the Quad stand for? It's a security dialogue between four countries. On maritime security, we're for the law of the sea, we're for a rule-based order, we're for freedom of navigation, we're for security of the sea lanes, which carry our trade and China's trade. But the Chinese see it as political containment of China. And they see the maritime spaces around China, the whole Indo-Pacific, whether it's Western Pacific, the seas near China, Indian Ocean, as being dominated essentially by powers who are very close to the US. And they see China-US rivalry as the primary geopolitical fault line today in the world. So therefore, they see the Quad, they actually oppose the Quad wherever they can, verbally at least. But the Quad is providing global public goods. It's now going to do vaccines, it's going to do resilient supply chains. And I don't think the Quad should stop just because the Chinese say they don't like it or not. I think the correct attitude on the part of the Quad is we're ready to work with anyone who wants to work with us. We're not asking you to join it if you don't want to. It's a dialogue, it's an open forum. And I think its strength is that it's open and flexible. And we'll work with anybody who works to the purposes that we've laid out. And I think that's really the way forward. I think the Chinese have to learn that ultimately other countries will make decisions based on their own interests, and China will have to adjust to those as well.
My follow-up to that was on the Quad itself is that are there also too many, are you concerned that there are too many inherent contradictions in this alliance? The fact is that all the countries in the Quad also have a very important economic relationship with China. And as long as that continues, how much of a pressure point can it be vis-a-vis China? And also, in terms of, say, democratic values, we are still the world's largest democracy, but let's face it, we are increasingly a flawed democracy. Every democracy index has sort of lowered our number, which is not a good look for India and not good for India. So are you worried that some of these contradictions may put the Quad under strain?
Well, firstly, I don't think the Quad is an alliance. What's an alliance? An alliance is a commitment to defend each other, right? If one of us is attacked, we'll all defend.
Which it's not. Yeah.
It's not. The Quad is not. It's a security dialogue. That's it. And it's a meeting. Now, it's last time it's been a virtual meeting of leaders at the leaders level for the first time they met. So, and it has said quite clearly what it's doing. And everything that it said has been concrete, practical, based on a certain value of having a free and open Indo-Pacific, based on rules, the international order, which everybody has signed on to. So, So if the Chinese are reacting to it because they think it's an alliance, I think that they're starting from the wrong premise. And I don't think the Quad is going to become an alliance either. There's no alliance on offer, nor is anybody asking for an alliance here. Certainly we're not. You've heard EAM has said quite clearly they were not asking for an alliance. And nowhere has the US or anybody offered you an alliance saying we'll defend India if you're attacked. No. So I think we need to get the basics clear. All the purposes that the Quad has so far said it's working on, I've never heard the Chinese or anyone actually attacking those. They attack straw men when they say this is nation NATO. Who said it's a nation NATO? There's no Article 5 like NATO. So frankly, a lot of the criticism is because of this expectation. But the other side of it is the Quad is not going to contain China. Quad is not going to change the balance of power in the region. Quad is going to do what it says it does, which is maritime security in this region, vaccines. It's going to help to build the rule-based order and provide global public goods, which other countries also want, and work with other countries. That's it. It's not going to stop China. It's not an alliance. So I think we have to get that clear. So they have different values. Democracy is challenged, frankly, everywhere. We've seen what happened on January 6th in the US.
Yeah.
There are challenges. It's a question we need to sort this out for ourselves. And we will. I mean, this is our internal issue. We might go through difficult times, but I think, for me, that's not the basis of the Quad. Quad is based on the congruence of interests, on the things we have in common. Quad, to my mind, is no answer to our problem on the land, because all the other three, frankly, are islands. The US behind the two biggest oceans, Australia, Japan. So we have a common interest in maritime security, but when it comes to our biggest problem is the land, the world's largest boundary dispute with China on land. And that's not something the Quad is going to solve for us, which is why I say it's not an alliance. We have our own interests, and for those interests, other interests, we'll work with other people.
There's a question from Rahul who wants to know whether you think there is a need to revisit the One China policy.
I don't see that. For me, it's not a question of whether you say something or not. What is the reality? The reality in today's world is there is one China and it is the PRC. And just denying it in words is not going to change that reality. If anything, that reality is becoming stronger and stronger. So I don't see what we achieve by that. If the purpose is to change China's behavior, changing our One China policy is not going to achieve that. So what are we looking for? For me, the purpose of policy, it must be realistic, so it must agree with reality out there. Secondly, the purpose is to create outcomes which are in your interest. Either create more options, whatever. So unless you can show me an outcome that comes out of changing our One China policy, it might suit you in a moment of anger or disappointment to say, I'll change my One China policy, and that it's a form of showing your anger and so on. But so what? That doesn't change the world. Our job is to change the world in our favor, right? So I'm not sure that changing One China policy is the answer to anything.
Another question that's come from Angad Lamba is that what are your views on biological warfare as a Chinese foreign policy tool? Do you think they're doing it?
If they were, they wouldn't tell you. B, I have no idea. I mean, I'm a private individual and have been now for the last 7 years. So there's no way that I can tell you yes or no. China signed on to all the bans, the prohibitions, the conventions, and claims not to use it. So these are the kinds of accusations which nobody can ever prove. And nobody will ever prove. And certainly no state is going to admit it. And nobody else has produced a smoking gun to show that it has. I think, a lot of this starts because of COVID, I think, and the suspicion that it leaked from a Chinese lab. I think the best account of this is there's an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists this time, just a few days ago, which says quite clearly that you can't prove either the zoonotic, that it came through animals, but you can't prove that it didn't either. You can't prove that it leaked from a lab, And whether it was deliberate or not, who knows? I mean, you can't prove it didn't either. But that if you actually put it through an analysis, the likelihood is that it came out of a lab. Now, whether it's deliberate or not, that takes an exercise in mind reading, which none of us is capable of.
Can I ask you, though, that when you look at the India-US relationship, what, according to you, is the ultimate goal of that relationship now? We've come much closer in the last few years. In recent weeks, there was a sense of exasperation with the whole vaccine issue and the US kind of belatedly waking up to India's COVID crisis and offering help. And I think, some columnists even sort of churned out these columns saying, well, what's the point of a Quad if on something as basic as this, you don't get help from the Americans? And so there was a lot of anger directed towards Washington. What is the aim? What is the outcome, you think, of this India-US relationship ultimately?
I think for India, what's most important is the US as a partner in transforming India, in making India a modern, prosperous, secure country, right? In building India up. I think that is much more important than anything else. And the US has played a role, a very important role. I mean, today we feed ourselves because of the Green Revolution, which we did with the US. There's a whole host of things. Secondly, the US, as a global superpower, affects our security one way or the other. And frankly, much of what she does, maintaining order, providing public goods, maritime security, and so on, works in our interest. It works for us. So we have congruence, and we have increasing congruence with the US on a whole host of issues where we've worked together. And in fact, that seems to be increasing all the time. And you've seen the defense, the intelligence, the security relationship has grown steadily over time. The way we look at issues has also grown more and more similar. So from an Indian point of view, the US is an essential partner to the most important thing we're doing, which is to try and transform India and in shaping an enabling environment around us. I don't think we look to the US to solve our immediate problems with, say, China, with Pakistan. These are things you have to take care of yourself. Any self-respecting power, ultimately you need to take care of yourself. You have to be able to take care of yourself. So I don't see China as being the glue in this relationship at all. I often say that part of the problem in India-US relations is that expectations are sometimes too high. We have two different societies. Look at the difference in our levels of development. Look at our geographical location. Look at our histories. We are very different. We won't be identical on everything, which is why we're not allies. We are partners. Partners meaning we work together where our interests coincide. And for me, that's the way forward for the relationship. It's not so. I mean, the US had a certain policy on vaccine exports, on what she was doing with even the precursor chemicals and so on that we need from them. And for us to expect the US to suddenly take care of our problems, I think was really unreasonable. When we weren't admitting the problems ourselves for an extended period of time. So a lot of that heat and that argument came out of very high expectations. That no, the US, and because of this fundamental, I think, misunderstanding, this idea that somehow we are allies and therefore we have identical interests. We don't. And I think we should live with that. And as Democrats, that is one thing we should understand. I mean, that's what we do all the time internally among ourselves, adjusting different interests. We need to do the same with the US and cut them a little slack. And vice versa. They need to cut us slack when we buy missiles from S-400s from
Russia. Yeah.
From the Russians. They need to cut us slack too. And that we are in a very different position from theirs.
We'd like to get Abhishek Banerjee on. He has a question for you, Mr. Menon. And while Abhishek is brought on to ask his question, I'll come to mine, which is, since we're talking about vaccines, there again has been so much debate, discussion, anger, I think, because we're going through this internal crisis with COVID right now, about why vaccines were exported to other countries. But, I think sometimes one has to take a step back, take a deep breath, and look at it, sort of dispassionately, and therefore ask you to do that. Why was this vaccine diplomacy, if you think it was important, and why has it been, would you say it's an important foreign policy success for India, the fact that we have exported so many to so many countries? This is a long-term investment.
We're in the middle of a crisis right now. Right now, I don't think is the time to do, well, unfortunate word, but post-mortem. I mean, this is not the time to investigate why did we make certain decisions. Were they right? Were they wrong? We need to do that, but we can't do it in the middle. Right now, we have more immediate problems. Handling the situation that we have, producing as much vaccine as we can, and getting as much as we can from wherever we can, whether it's Sputnik or wherever, and protecting our people. I mean, that's our number one priority right now. Later, I think we can sit back and look. My own view, frankly, is gratitude is not a major commodity in international relations. And if you run your policy on the basis of, oh, I'll do somebody a favor and then he's going to be grateful and he will do me, it doesn't work that way. How grateful are we as Indians to the US for the Green Revolution? Does anybody even remember it? No. I mean, you saw the reaction to, so I think, and if you look at the amount of assistance that other countries have given us, and look at our attitude towards those countries, we decide our attitude based on how we see our interests, not on the basis of what they did for us in the past or how grateful we are. And that's true of all countries. We function on the basis of our interests. So to say that we did vaccine diplomacy in the hope of gaining influence and gratitude and long-term ability to affect other people's decisions, I'm not sure that's really the right way to go about it.
Okay.
And I think we need to, therefore, think this through much more carefully and maybe look back at the decisions once we're past this crisis and look back at these decisions and see, how we took them and why we took them.
Wasim wants to know, what has worked better for India, having a Democratic or Republican president?
In the US?
Yeah.
Well, luckily, the whole transformation over the last 30 years of India-US relations has been a bipartisan effort and has been supported by both, well, starting with Clinton, Democrat, then George W. Bush, Republican, then Barack Obama, Democrat, Trump, Republican, and now again Biden. And in fact, with President Biden, you have a US president who probably knows India better than any US president before. And he has a team who's also familiar with India, who are actually active participants in the transformation of India-US relations. So it's bipartisan in the US, and I think it should stay that way. And we should work to keep it that way, working with everybody. Let their politics stop at their borders, and let's not get India-US relations into US domestic politics or polarization, and vice versa. I think we need to do the same thing here. Because in the heat of political argument, I noticed that maybe even in India, that's fraying a little bit.
I wanted to ask you, as we get more questions from students, also about how the rise of ultra-nationalism in India, and it's not just happening in India, it's happening in so many other parts of the world, but how that's impacted the way India is conducting its foreign policy. And one sees that, the MEA now is very touchy about press reports in the foreign media, which was very unlike the past. I mean, I've never known the MEA to react to what the foreign media necessarily writes or what a pop star has to say about protests here and so on. So how do you think that has affected the way we are doing our diplomacy?
It seems to be happening around the world, as you said. I think what's happened is, as governments' capacity to deliver has diminished, their promises have grown bigger and bigger. As economies have slowed down, they rely more and more on nationalism, on the sense of, hyper-nationalism, actually, for legitimacy. And therefore, now they're playing to this gallery at home that they think exists. I honestly believe, I mean, from my whole experience, when you could travel or whenever I talk to people around India, that the ordinary Indian is quite sensible about foreign policy. He or she knows what matters. But there is somehow this belief in Delhi that now there's much more, and I think some of it fed by social media, by what you see, the extreme sort of views. Maybe they're responding to that. I don't know. The real problem for me is that this kind of hyper-nationalism and leaders who base their whole image on being strong, national, assertive, muscular, whatever, they are much less capable of the give and take, bargaining, negotiation that is the core of diplomacy and that you need if you want to settle disputes peacefully and to manage disputes. Then you need to be able to do that kind of thing. And if you're strong and nationalist and so on, then it becomes that much more difficult to do. And this is one reason why you can, wherever you look, hotspots are hot, flashpoints are really troublesome, and there's uncertainty, and people are really nervous. There's uncertainty in the system. International system is very high. And you're not making progress on big adversarial relationships. Whether it's Pakistan, whether it's China, and you actually are getting into arguments even with small neighbors like Nepal and so on, where you didn't used to have these kinds of arguments. You now have language used, which frankly I find quite distasteful. You call somebody termites, you can't call human beings termites, and then expect no consequences whatsoever. You know, now, so we are, I think, in an unfortunate place where it's not just the language, but it's a mindset that this kind of language reveals and this kind of sensitivity, the inferiority complex that, frankly, this kind of sensitivity reveals when you react to every statement by anybody. I remember Indira Gandhi had written on a file, you know, we used to stamp every map on every book that came into India saying the boundaries are not authentic, this, that. You remember customs used to do this. And Mrs. Gandhi wrote on a file saying, just because some publisher in the US draws the wrong boundary, does that change the boundaries of India? Why are we doing this? Of course, it never stopped. I mean, and because I don't think she ever got a real answer. But absolutely, what difference does it make? You know, it doesn't change the boundaries of India. What changes those boundaries or changes the facts on the ground is what your neighbors do and what you do.
Which the extension of that that issue then is also the importance of India's democratic credentials, and having been a seasoned diplomat yourself, having dealt with so many issues over decades, how important is that? When India is particularly looked at as a counterweight to China in the region, why is it so important for us to defend our democracy, to ensure that we uphold those principles, which right now we are under a lot of heavy criticism for?
Well, I think we should be defending our democratic principles and our constitution for our own sake, not because of China, not because of how other people look at it. Frankly, I don't care how other people look at our democracy, as long as Indians are happy with their democracy and that it's serving Indian interests. I think that's the important thing. But the second part of it is the rest of the world will deal with you depending on their interests, not depending on your democratic credentials or how good you are or how bad you are. They will deal with you no matter what, if it serves their interests. And so I don't think that connection between how you run India and how we manage our own affairs, if you make a complete hash of your own affairs, destroy your economy, if you show yourself as incapable of acting as an organized state or of defending yourself and so on, they'll draw their own conclusions. But if they see it as a place where they can make money, where you can be useful to them, they'll work with you. And so I don't think that has very much to do with the so-called values, norms, etc. of the international system or of democratic norms. I think we should be democratic in our own interest. And I have a very simple argument for that. If you look at India, we are each of us a minority in either language, religion, caste, region. You break us down in different ways. And the only way we can all prosper together is by actually being a democracy where everybody has a say in the making of policy. Because if we don't do that, if there's a small group who thinks they know best for everyone else, frankly, there will be disaster. And we've seen that happen over and over again.
In fact, a lot of people who are writing in with questions and comments are pointing out about how Bangladesh has really helped India with medicines, vitamins, during this COVID crisis. And you made that remark about the termites, which was an unfortunate reference to those coming in from Bangladesh into India. There was an interesting question here that someone had asked. I think it was Mohit. He wants to know that should India raise issues like the Uyghurs and China's treatment of them at multilateral forums like the UN? Would that be
the same thing that I said on One China policy?
Pointless. Huh.
What for? If you show me some advantage to it, yes. If the entire Islamic world were out there saying, here's a serious issue, it bothers us, and our relations with the Islamic world are important to us, I would say yes. But today, that's not the situation. Even the Turks are silent. And so, I'm not quite sure. For me, all these questions, it depends on show me the outcome. And show me the outcome that's good for India that comes out of doing these things. Not just I feel good because I've expressed myself. Bol diya usko. That's not the point here.
Okay, Pritish Anand, are you there? Pritish, you have a question for Mr. Menon. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. So my question is just a follow-up to what you mentioned, that we are getting into arguments with smaller countries, not just with Pakistan and China, but countries like Myanmar, Nepal. We now talk more about security issues, migrant issues, than things like trade and commerce. Looking forward, how can we strengthen our relationship with countries with whom we used to have a good relationship in the past?
Well, I think given the fact that the world is a much more uncertain place, I think it's important that we concentrate in the subcontinent, in the Indian Ocean region. And there are three things that we need to do, seems to me. One is we should make ourselves, and this is not difficult because we do have a large economy, which has been in the past and can be again a major driver of growth. So we should be a source of prosperity and growth in the region. And we should link our economies together and work together. Why did Sri Lanka survive, 26 years of civil war with only 1 year of negative growth? Nepal, 12 years of civil war with, 2 years of negative growth, because their economies were tied to the Indian economy, and the Indian economy was growing very fast in those years and took them along. So we need to be a source of prosperity for the region. Secondly, we should be seen as a source of security in the region, not as an as a destabilizing element. And that is not difficult, frankly, because they all have interests in making sure, and what we have done with Bangladesh over the last 15 years, for instance, is proof of that, where we've worked together on our security, their security, and we've seen it as being interlinked. And we've managed to improve the relationship considerably over the last 15 years by doing this. But most of all, I think there is a need for making sure that we are seen as a positive force for good in the region. And there, I think, I don't know why we are so nervous of actually getting multilateral fora working. SAARC, for instance, if Pakistan doesn't want to participate in something, doesn't mean that the rest of us can't do anything. SAARC itself permits that. The rules permit it. I think we should use every means like that, because the fact is we are a huge, preponderant presence in the lives of all our smaller neighbors. They will instinctively look for external balancers, whether it's the US, whether it's China, because they don't want to be left with one huge presence. So we cannot seek an exclusive relationship in the neighborhood. But we do have affinities, we have presence, we have advantages which no other powers have, whether it is in terms of culture, language, religion, ethnicities across borders. I mean, with Bangladesh, for instance, if we did border huts and opened up that border to trading on a much bigger scale, no other external balancer from far away can match that. If the Chinese can build bridges and big infrastructure projects, good luck to them. Let them do that. But let's do the things we do well with our neighbors and be seen as a force for good in the neighborhood. And for me, if we do these three things single-mindedly, and I think Bangladesh, the last 15 years of Bangladesh is proof that it can work. I think, frankly, we can change the situation around.
All right. Is Anjali here? Anjali has a question for you. Meanwhile, while we get Anjali on, Tahir Bhatt has a question for you, Mr. Menon. Tahir, go ahead. Please unmute your mic.
Still muted.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so my question is to Honorable Professor Shivshankar Menon, sir, because firstly, I want to actually extend my gratitude and thanks to Honorable Sir, because he has written a very magnum opus book. I was yesterday just going through the very interesting pages of your book, sir, because I am currently now trying to write a review of this very book.
Oh,
yes, for some important publication houses.
I hope you enjoy it.
Yes, it's a brilliant book, sir. So, sir, my question to your good self is that you have also mentioned that India actually wants to be a Vishwaguru, or over a period of time. Over a period of time, we have heard about that India is a leading power, or India is a kind of a progressive or a benign power, the power in making actually. So, sir, my question to you is that how actually India has actually failed to actually be a net security provider so far as our immediate neighborhood is concerned, that is Afghanistan, and whereby I think the emergence of Taliban is actually going to actually prevent India's soft power projection. So and apart from that, so far as some American writers are concerned, I mean, they have made it pretty clear that how India has actually been seen nowadays a kind of not that very great power, or it has been seen in a very bad light, because India is seen that India is actually making some efforts to actually come up with some instability, or it is actually using Afghanistan as a base for promoting instability in Balochistan.
Okay. So, Tahir, let Mr. Menon answer that question.
Okay, ma'am.
Your question is more to do with the Afghan situation.
Well,
Mr.
Right. I think one is on this whole Vishwaguru, superpower, great power. Why is India not yet a superpower? That will come, but first we have to transform India. As I keep saying in this book, I've said before, I'll say again, our priority is to make India into a modern, prosperous, secure country where every Indian can achieve his or her full potential. That's our job. And foreign policy is supposed to make that possible, is to create an environment, an enabling environment for that transformation of India, not to make India, improve India's status, or to get other people to recognize us as a great power, or to get revenge for anything, for partition, for whatever. That's not what we are about. We should concentrate. We have enough to do at home, improving our own people's lives. And for me, that's much more important. So this whole Vishwaguru, great powers, why are we not a superpower? Frankly, it suggests to me some kind of inferiority complex. Why are we busy chasing status when we have more important things to do in our own country? On Afghanistan, the Americans are withdrawing. I mean, that's now certain. And this whole negotiation is about a face-saving withdrawal, so that they can leave and say at least that they weren't driven out, that they left in a negotiated, with a negotiated withdrawal. They call it a peace process. It's not a peace process. It's nowhere near a peace process. There are different ideas of what will happen once they withdraw. My own sense is that three things will happen. One is The Afghans themselves will have to sort this out, whether they do it peacefully, violently, between the existing government, between the Taliban, between the various ethnic groups, between the various power holders, because power is distributed within Afghanistan. That's something they will have to sort out. Secondly, all the neighbors in the regional powers who have frankly freeloaded on the American military presence so far, they will have to deal with the consequences of what happens in Afghanistan, whether it is the Taliban or not. This is not going to be 1996 all over again. This is a very different Afghanistan already. And I think if, as people fear, there's going to be a riot, Taliban will become much more powerful, there'll be an export of extremism, of terrorism, and so on. First victims are the immediate neighbors, are those who are actually physically next to them, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Xinjiang, China, whether it's Iran. And let's see how they cope with this and what they actually do. So it seems to me there has to be some kind of regional response, including us. I think Istanbul was an attempt to do that. I think we're confusing two issues. One is Afghanistan's internal arrangements are the Afghans' business. They should sort that out. And I don't think we should get into this business of drafting constitutions and telling them who lead them and so on. I think to talk of Bond 2 is not a good idea. Secondly, I think the regional powers have to step up, and they will step up differently once the Americans are gone, and they have to face the reality. You know, I say this over and over again. The risk is for Pakistan. It is Pakistan that is being Talibanized. It's not Afghanistan being Pakistanized. Mm. So if Pakistan sees its own enlightened self-interest, it needs to do something about this. And I hope they draw the right conclusion. The same with China. There are risks for China. She has investments in Afghanistan, but she also has a restive province in Xinjiang, where she hasn't helped things by what she's done over the last few years. So it's going to be, it'll be rough. It won't be easy. It won't be smooth. But I'm not quite so worried. And in any case, whining about what's going to happen is not going to change anything. And I think it's time we stopped whining about, oh, why are the Americans leaving? Oh, things are going to hell. Oh, the sky is going to fall. That's not going to help anyway. I think we are quite capable of dealing with the consequences. And we have dealt with worse in the past. And we will deal with it in the future as well. But I think you need to be open-minded and pragmatic. Work with whoever you can work with.
Before I come to Anjali, I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Menon, what you thought of the moves by India and Pakistan to sort of have this back channel open, secret talks, and then mediation by the UAE, which interestingly has not been denied till date by the MEA at all. So therefore, we take that as a given. How do you look at that? Do you welcome this development? And given what you said earlier,
I have no idea what they've done. I have no idea what was said, what was agreed. So far, all I've seen is the November 2003 ceasefire being reinforced, and so far it seems to have held. And if they've reimposed that it works, good luck. What else? I mean, I've seen all kinds of speculative stories. But since we don't know what actually happened, who met, what they did, what they've said to each other, I don't know. I'd be very careful at this stage. You know, we've gone through this dance before with Pakistan.
Yeah.
And we go through this euphoria and then, you know, the depths of depression. And we know that better India-Pakistan relations have many enemies. In Pakistan, some in India, but many in Pakistan. And there are institutional interests at work who have an interest in managed hostility, controlled hostility between India and Pakistan. And so for me, I have an open mind. Good luck. I hope they can do something to improve the relationship. But I'm not, color me skeptical.
I'm not surprised. Adil, are you here? Please go ahead with your question to Mr. Menon. Unmute your mic, Adil, please. Adil, you'll have to unmute. Yes, go ahead. Adil. We can hear you now. Go ahead. All right. I don't know if Adil is there. I mean, I can see the window, but for some reason, Adil is not able to ask. Sekat, would you like to go ahead with your question, please? Sekat?
Yes. Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Firstly, good evening, sir. I think, so I'm from NID Trichy and you came down to Pragyan in, I think, 2018.
Yeah.
So my question, I have two questions. One question is on the sovereignty front. Especially in the last few months, we have seen that while foreign media and foreign diplomats and the head of nations have criticized our country's domestic policies, and at few instances they were legitimate, but our government somehow seemed to have a very defensive approach towards it, and they have shunned down comments from outside saying that it is harming our sovereignty. As the former security advisor, sir, what do you feel like? Is it the case, or that criticism should keep flowing in because that's what keeps the democracy ticking in? And my second question is, with respect to the current vaccine crisis that the world is seeing, and with a few people who are withholding the IP rights because they have huge investments in these pharma companies that are producing these vaccines, and kind of opposing WTO to give this IP rights to the developing nations, do you feel that if this is done, then the whole world can be vaccinated, and this is like, this should be done at the cost of humanity, and the nations like India, US, UK should come together to resolve this?
Okay. All right. Thanks.
On sovereignty and foreign interference, frankly, I don't think that what they say is going to change very much in India. There's an old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. They will say what they have to say because they think it helps them to get what they want, maybe on some other issue. So countries will say, depending on their domestic compulsions, maybe they need to say it because they want their people, expect them to say things. But we should be democratic and follow our own path. And we shouldn't expect outsiders to solve our problems of how we run ourselves. That's for us to sort out. I'm not saying that we should, external interference, frankly, for me is a secondary issue. First, we have to deal with our own issue, and we should answer the substance of it. The best answer to all these image, narrative, discourse, all these problems is to do the right thing at home. I mean, if you did the right thing, frankly, if you took care of yourself, did what you had to, frankly, all the rest of it becomes secondary and much easier to handle. On the vaccine crisis, the IPRs, I'm very glad that we pushed for this since October. We've got where we are, but there's still a long way to go because the opposition is still very strong. The EU, some are sitting on the fence like Canada, but there are other countries who still oppose it very strongly. It'll take a while, and even if the WTO agrees, it will still take a couple of years for production to actually ramp up. Before that, there are things we can do to speed up production in India. We have an Indian-developed vaccine. We should do compulsory licensing. Let other Indian companies also manufacture it. In other words, we should do internally, and this is provided for in TRIPS. If we did compulsory licensing at home, we would be doing what we are asking the rest of the world to do on IPRs. So there are a whole host of steps. The real problem is a supply and demand problem here. Even with IPRs, if WTO were to agree tomorrow, which is very unlikely, even with compulsory licensing, if you look at the numbers that we need, the world as a whole of vaccines, and the numbers that we can produce, we need to do anything we can to ramp up those numbers of how much we produce. And that's where we should be concentrating with other people. But I think each of these is a contribution towards that, whether it's IPRs, whether it's compulsory licensing, whether it's entering into other arrangements, the way, the Serum Institute did with AstraZeneca. They took a risk. They went out and did it. You need to do everything you can just to increase supply. And that's what we should be concentrating on today.
There's an interesting question here from Leo Saldana from Bangalore, Mr. Menon, who's asking, what do you think India's response should have been to the situation in Myanmar, not just the recent coup, but also the Rohingya crisis?
Well, my own sense is that when the Rohingya crisis hit, these are two very important neighbors for us, both Myanmar and Bangladesh. And we could see that this was going to make their relationship very difficult, but also create a humanitarian crisis. My advice at that stage was we should be offering our good offices as a neutral to try and help to deal with the humanitarian crisis and to help them both come to some kind of managed solution of the problem. Because it affects our broader interests. For instance, if you want to create cooperation around the Bay of Bengal in maritime security, if Myanmar and Bangladesh are not talking to each other, it becomes very difficult to do anything together in the Bay of Bengal. We have big interests in Myanmar, but we have equally or even bigger interests in Bangladesh. So we need to work to actually try and bring them together. And I think we could have done that rather than immediately saying, oh, these are terrorists and deciding, taking a stand, then changing that stand. So for me, that would have been the natural Indian role. Today, now that the military has taken power, has overthrown the results of the elections, I think, frankly, what we have done now, saying, ASEAN, you do this, you know this best, I think is important and useful because ASEAN also has more leverage within Myanmar than we do for various reasons, I mean, of all kinds. So, but I think we should work very closely with ASEAN and support them in seeing what we do. And I think we should separate the humanitarian problem from the larger political problem. And there, I think, frankly, we just saw a really strange instance, actually. The center was saying, close the borders, don't allow anyone in. And Mizoram said, rightly, that we're not going to keep our cousins out because Mizos are Chin on the other side. I mean, they intermarry, they're the same tribes, same people. And they said no, and they kept their borders open and actually offered sanctuary. And that is part of the Indian tradition of actually, we have offered sanctuary to our neighbors. It's not that we've assimilated everyone or borne the cost. After all, we took 10 million refugees from Bangladesh, but they went home, most of them.
The Dalai Lama and the
Tibetans, Sri Lankan Tamils. I mean, you name it. Myanmar also after 88. So for me, that part of non-refoulement, which we have done traditionally without having signed the international convention and so on, without making a big fuss, for me, that is very important. It actually serves your foreign policy interests in the neighborhood. And it creates leverage, one, but it also does a great deal for your influence in the neighborhood. And it has always been so. And I mean, a good example is Iran after the revolution in 1979. And there was a stage in the mid-North, roughly in 2008, 2009, when a lot of the leadership in Iran, the foreign minister, everybody had all been educated in India. They'd all fled as students from the Shah's police and so on. And they'd studied in Bangalore or various parts. And it was much easier to get our business done. We have been traditionally an open society, and the book actually makes this point. The more we engage, the more we get connected to Asia, to the rest of Asia, the better India has done historically.
Mr. Menon, we're completely out of time. It's been wonderful. It's been wonderful to speak to you. It's been wonderful personally to see you after so long, but for all of us, a real education to talk about, everything from India, China, and the India-US relationship, how India should be dealing with its neighbors and others. And it's been a real pleasure. I just want to tell everyone before we go that we have our social media handles, the Kautilya School of Public Policy. It's Kautilya, SPP. You can follow us on Twitter. We are on Facebook. We have a YouTube channel and Instagram feed. I'm going to explode with all the social media handles that we have. My own handle is at Nidhi on Twitter. So I often do retweet what Kautilya is doing. And if you're still interested in applying for our master's program, it's starting this July. We're still accepting applications. It's a 2 years master's degree. So please do apply if you're interested. We do still have some slots open. Mr. Menon, a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us.